They're not vampires, though they're highly sensitive to blood. They're not krakens, but they lurk below the surface, waiting for the right moment to strike. And they're not just a prop for B-list Hollywood movies. They're sharks, and they're as real as you and I. Welcome to Fierce's Shark Marathon, a collection of some of the most gruesome stories involving the most feared fish on our planet. After hearing these stories, you might want to think twice before swimming in the ocean. 20-year-old Jana Lutterop had left her West Germany home to work as an au pair in the Seattle suburb of Issaquah. She spent her time looking after 4-year-old twins and their 5-year-old brother. But after a year on the job, she booked a vacation to Hawaii. She left Seattle in August and planned to return to Germany in September. She and her friends headed to Palauea Beach in Makena on the Hawaiian island of Maui. Also known as White Rock Beach, it's less busy than some of Maui's hotspots. The golden sands are flanked by volcanic rock. To the north side, there is excellent snorkeling, with rock pools for those less inclined to enter the water. Sea turtles frequent the area, and colorful sea life clings to the volcanic rocks. The beach gently slopes into the water, making it a popular swimming spot for locals, but it's often regarded as a relatively unused beach by visitors. With less crowds, it feels like a little piece of paradise, away from the hustle and bustle of the large towns, away from the throng of tourists. On Wednesday, August 14, 2013, Jana entered the warm water. The water was choppy, little wavelets formed on the surface. She pulled a mask and snorkel over her face, slipped into her fins, and dipped her face into the ocean. Beneath the surface, visibility was poor, but brightly colored fish darted everywhere. It was a beautiful wildlife haven. But Jana wasn't alone. The tranquil underwater scene was about to change. The peace and beauty were about to become a scene from a nightmare, a bloodbath. A shark homed in on the shallows, scouring the ocean for a meal, an opportunistic hunter. It spotted Jana swimming at the surface. She was 100 yards from shore. She didn't see the shark approaching. It came at her with terrific speed, torpedoing upwards. It struck her from below. The hit knocked the air from Jana's lungs as she flew into the air. Disoriented, Jana scrambled about in the water, and then she felt a firm tug on her arm. She looked to her side, and a shark had her whole arm in its jaws. The nose of the shark was just inches from Jana's face. She looked right into the shark's eyes. The pressure in her arm built until it felt like it would snap, and then shockingly, it did. The shark severed Jana's arm from her body. Blood poured into the ocean. Jana screamed for help. The shark submerged below the surface. Frantically, Jana kicked and kicked, trying to make it to shore. She was losing blood rapidly. She didn't think she was going to make it. The attack had been too brutal, too forceful. Her group of friends could see her splashing about in the water, and they cried out, but none of them dared to go into the water to save her. 57-year-old Rick Moore, who was vacationing from California with his friend Nicholas Grisafi, heard a blood-curdling scream from the beach. The two men turned around and looked out to sea. They could see Jana struggling 100 yards out. She was surrounded in a sea of red. Without hesitating, Rick ran into the water. He swam as fast as he could, right into the middle of the cloud of blood. Less than 10 feet from the young German, he noticed her arm was missing. It had been torn completely off. He told her to grab hold of him with her other arm as he supported her head. Then, swimming on his back toward the shore, he kicked for dry land. It was slow but steady progress. As he tried to calm Jana, it suddenly dawned on him just how much danger he had put himself in. The shark was still in the area. He was carrying wounded prey, surrounded by blood. He could have been attacked by the shark at any time. Other sharks could have been drawn to the area, enticed by the smell of fresh blood. Still, he kicked, continuing to progress toward dry land. All the while, Jana was terrified she was going to die. She kept repeating it over and over, telling Rick that she wasn't going to make it. "I'm dying," she said. "I know I'm going to die." Rick tried to reassure her, but he knew that with each passing second, the young woman's chances of survival were fading. He prayed out loud to God. He prayed for protection from the shark. He prayed that they made it to shore safely. He was worried that at any second he would see the telltale sign of a shark, its fin slicing through the water towards them, a sharp tug on his legs as it dragged him underwater. But he was determined to make it, determined to get to dry land. When they were close to the beach, Rick's friend Nicholas waded into the shallows. The water came up to his neck, and he took Jana from Rick and pulled her onto the beach. She was drifting in and out of consciousness. She had lost so much blood that it no longer poured from her open wound. As they laid Jana down on the sand, 23-year-old Joshua Craddock from London called the emergency services. He had watched the whole rescue. He was awestruck by Rick's bravery as the man had dived into the blood-stained water. They lifted Jana onto a makeshift stretcher, a beachgoer's kayak, and carried her up the trail to the street. Jana's friends did nothing to help the situation. They were understandably in a state of shock, but they left it up to strangers and passers-by to help their friend. They cried as they watched their bikini-clad friend pulled from the sea, covered in blood and missing an arm. When they arrived at the street, a police officer tied a tourniquet around Jana's shoulder. She was barely conscious by this point. Her breaths became shallow, her heartbeat faint. Then she stopped breathing. Immediately, high school teachers Rick and Nicholas began performing CPR. Jana's friends just stood there watching until an ambulance arrived and rushed Jana to Maui Memorial Medical Center. Rick and Nicholas visited her at the medical center 2 days later. Doctors told them that she was in stable condition. It looked like Jana might make it, but 2 days later, she became critically ill and was placed on life support. Tragically, Jana lost her fight 1 week after the attack. Despite doctors' best efforts, she didn't survive. Her family spoke of the enthusiastic, happy young woman that Jana was. She was beautiful and strong and will always be remembered laughing. Rick and Nicholas reflected on the attack. They replayed the ordeal over and over in their minds. They prayed for Jana's recovery. Nicholas wonders whether he had done enough. He questions whether he should have swum out to help Rick bring Jana in. Maybe he should have pulled on his fins and helped pull her to shore. She would have made it to dry land quicker, saving precious time. Nicholas said that the attack has affected him. He still goes into the water, but he won't stray far from the beach. It was a terrible thing to have happened to someone so young, and for those involved in the rescue, it'll likely remain vivid in their memory for the rest of their lives. It was May 21, 2023 in New Jersey. As the spring weather began to heat up, young surfer Maggie Drozdowski took to the sea with her friend Sarah O'Donnell. After strapping their surfboards to their legs, the pair jogged into the water and paddled out from the shore at 110th Street Beach in Stone Harbor. It was a glorious sunny afternoon, perfect for catching some waves. But their surfing trip was about to take a sinister turn. Stone Harbor on New Jersey's southern tip attracts thousands of visitors each year. Situated 30 miles south of Atlantic City, visitors are drawn to the white sandy beaches, the sailing excursions, boutique downtown shops, and the promise of excellent surf. Maggie and her family had traveled from Chester County in Pennsylvania, 90 miles northwest of the harbor. The surf was good. The two 15-year-old friends were enjoying the rush of the waves and the freedom of the great outdoors. But the pair wasn't alone. As they rode the waves, something lurked beneath the surface. A predator was on the prowl. It honed in on the two girls, investigating as it came closer and closer. Suddenly, a large wave knocked Maggie from her board. She fell into the water. When she surfaced, she looked around for her surfboard and grabbed hold of it. Her body and legs dangled in the water as she tried to pull herself back on board. But before she could do so, she felt it. Something large grabbed hold of her left foot. She didn't realize what it was at first, but it was strong and powerful. It had her in its grip and pulled her underwater. Unable to take a breath of air, Maggie's lungs felt as though they were going to burst. The pressure on her lower leg grew as she tried to kick the animal off, frantically shaking her leg and kicking with the other. Terrified, Maggie screamed under the waves, bubbles escaping from her mouth as she fought for the surface. Looking up, she could see shards of sunlight penetrating the water. She reached upwards, desperately trying to pull herself to safety. But she kept being pulled downwards. She kept kicking her leg, furiously trying to break free, but the creature held on. It felt like an eternity, but miraculously, she felt her foot pull free from the jaws of a shark, and she kicked for the surface. When she felt the cool air on her face, she gasped and took in a deep breath. She yelled at her friend Sarah, who paddled over. She splashed about in the sea, panicking and shouting that she had been bitten by something. Sarah told her to get on her board immediately and paddle to shore. Maggie climbed onto her surfboard, lying flat and pulling at the water with her hands. A trail of blood leaked from Maggie's torn foot, a trail that enticed sharks nearby. A tantalizing scent spilling into the ocean behind the two girls. Together, they inched towards the beach. With every minute that passed, Maggie's adrenaline surged. Was it still out there? Was it following them? Were they going to make it back to the shore? With her foot out of action, Maggie didn't manage to catch a single wave into shore. Instead, she paddled the whole way. The progress was slow. The beach never seemed to get any closer. Her arms were aching. Salt water stung her eyes, but she was focused on getting out of the water as quickly as possible. She didn't know how badly damaged her foot was. She hadn't taken the time to investigate. That didn't matter right now. It was an agonizing 4 minutes of frantic paddling before they made it to the shallows and jumped off their boards. They ran out of the sea and sat down on the beach, breathing heavily. They had made it. They had survived what they were soon to realize was a shark attack. Sarah didn't realize the seriousness of her friend's injury. She assumed Maggie had been pinched by a crab or something. It never crossed her mind that it could be a shark, and that it could have been a very different ending. But when they inspected Maggie's injury, they realized just how lucky they had been. It suddenly dawned on the two girls that it had been a shark that had bitten Maggie's foot. But what kind of shark and what size, they will never know. They never saw the animal. There was no sign of it in the water. No warning and no time to prepare for the attack. Sharks often test out their prey by biting it first. Only then do they realize that humans aren't their typical prey and they move off. But all too often, that first bite can be fatal, usually due to the blood loss the victim suffers. Only once they were out of the water and on the safety of the land did Maggie start to feel the pain from her injury. The deep gashes began to sting, her lower leg throbbed. They needed to get medical help as soon as possible. Infection can spread rapidly throughout the body following a shark bite. The two girls wrapped the foot up in a towel before Sarah helped Maggie hobble back across the beach with her surfboard. They made it back to her family, who was nearby. Deep lacerations covered her foot and calf. Blood oozed from the open wounds and spilled onto the sand. The blood flow was so great that Maggie feared she may lose her foot. She didn't know the extent of the damage. They called emergency services, and volunteer firefighters were the first responders to arrive on the scene. They began dressing Maggie's foot, trying to apply pressure to reduce the blood loss. She was then lifted onto an ATV and driven across the sand, before being transferred via ambulance to Cape Regional Medical Center. Once she was there, she received 6 stitches to close up her wounds. Although Maggie and Sarah didn't see the shark, the New Jersey State Southern Regional Medical Examiner said the injuries were consistent with a shark bite. Having survived the attack, Maggie has said that she is afraid to enter the water again. She knows how lucky she is to have survived, but it'll be a while before she paddles back out on her surfboard again. For a short while after the attack, Maggie moved about on crutches with her foot still heavily bandaged. She wanted to share her story in the hope of raising awareness to other beachgoers and surfers who entered the water. Her attack came just days after 2 men were bitten while fishing in the Florida Keys. The beaches along Stone Harbor weren't closed following Maggie's attack, but officials warned people to be extra vigilant and to take precautions, such as removing reflective jewelry and avoiding swimming in or near fishing areas. Shark attacks in New Jersey are incredibly rare. Since records began, there have only been 16 documented attacks in the state, with the previous attack happening back in 2006. In fact, Gavin Naylor, the director of the Florida Program for Shark Research, said that you're 200 times more likely to drown than you are to be bitten by a shark. As far as shark attacks go in the United States, Florida is the shark bite capital of the world. Receiving more sunshine than anywhere else in the world, Perth is ideal for visitors and locals alike. The bustling city is just a stone's throw away from the golden sandy beaches, marine wildlife, and wineries along Australia's western coastline. Swimming, snorkeling, diving, and surfing are popular water sports around Perth, activities that attract people near and far. One resident of Perth was 57-year-old Paul Millachip, originally from the UK. He was an incredibly fit man. He had competed in 6 Ironman competitions, grueling triathlons which involve a 2.4-mile swim, followed by a 112-mile bike ride, and a marathon run to finish with. He and his wife regularly ran, cycled, and swam along Perth's coast. They ventured down to the water 2 or 3 times every week, the Australian weather enabling an outdoor lifestyle that they loved. They had been in Australia for many years. As British expats, they had built a life for themselves there and had become part of the community. On Saturday, the 6th of November, Paul planned on swimming 1 kilometer that day. His wife joined him in the water, but got out soon afterwards. It was too cold for her. She decided to get changed and wait for Paul on the beach. She looked out over the water. There were surfers and other swimmers. Along the coastline, a predator was on the prowl. A tiger shark, 3 meters long, scoured the shoreline for its next meal, drawn closer to the shore by the warmer waters and its prey. But this was an opportunistic hunter, capable of taking down dolphins, seals, and sea lions. It homed in on Paul, spotting his silhouetted figure on the surface above it. Once it had decided to attack, there was no stopping it. It was pure instinct. Millions of years of evolution converged to create an impressive predator, one of the most feared of its kind. Paul probably didn't see it coming. He was unprepared and unaware of what was about to happen in a few seconds' time. It came at him from the depth, approaching him from underneath and behind, out of his field of vision. The speed and power of the attack most likely caused catastrophic injury to Paul. It would have felt like a bus hitting him, knocking the air from his lungs, disorienting him, before dragging him beneath the waves. The attack happened close to the dinghy. The 4 teenage boys watched in horror as an enormous shark arched out of the water, its dark gray skin reflecting the sunlight before submerging with Paul in its jaws. There was no scream from Paul, no thrashing about in the water. It was an instantaneous, lethal attack. When his wife emerged from the dressing room, she scoured the ocean for Paul. She couldn't see him. Instead, she saw the 4 frantic teenagers shouting from their dinghy. They were screaming about a shark attack, motoring up and down the shoreline, telling swimmers and surfers to get out of the water. People made a dash for the rock, scrambling to get out of the water. Panic spread across the beach. It was terrifying for the young Year 10 pupils. A surfer had shouted out about the attack, and the 4 teenagers pulled up their anchor and immediately motored toward Paul. They made it to within inches from him, just inches from the attack. They witnessed Paul being dragged under by the enormous shark just next to their boat. It could easily have been one of them. It could easily have knocked them from their small dinghy and attacked them. They saw the sheer size of the shark as its back arched out of the water. The distance between the dorsal fin and its tail was immense. After warning the other swimmers and surfers, one of the boys pulled out his mobile phone and called the emergency services. His wife hadn't seen the attack. She had only seen some splashing in the water as she came out of the changing rooms, and Paul had vanished. There was a helicopter on patrol at the time of Paul's attack, but it was not in the vicinity of Port Beach. The Westpac Lifesaver Rescue helicopter was scouring the sea 80 kilometers away when the report came in about the shark attack. It immediately diverted to where Paul was last seen and began a search for him. In total, 5 water police and sea rescue boats and 2 helicopters were sent to scour the area. Lifeguards stationed at a nearby beach also rushed to Port Beach to help in the search, but it was too late. Paul was already gone. There was nothing anybody could do. 24 hours later, the search for Paul was called off. Only a pair of his goggles was ever recovered from the site. His wife had the agonizing job of phoning the family, who lived overseas, and informing them of the terrible events. He was a father to 2 grown-up children. She thanked the boys in the dinghy for their quick action. Although they couldn't save Paul, they may have saved other lives by warning others to get out of the water. Eyewitnesses helped piece together the attack, but it seemed that it came out of nowhere and happened so quickly that there wasn't anything anyone could do. It was the 3rd fatal shark attack to happen in Australian waters that year. The beach was closed for the rest of that weekend. It was cordoned off by officials, a sight that is becoming increasingly common across Australia. But on Monday morning, it reopened again. Nervously, some swimmers braved the water. The Port Beach Polar Bears are a local swimming group that have been swimming at the beach for decades. On that Monday morning, their numbers dwindled. Many of the group were understandably anxious about going in the water again and decided not to. Others, however, weren't deterred. They said that they know the risks. Sharks are always at the back of people's minds when they enter the water in Australia. But swimming is their passion, and they don't want to let the relatively uncommon shark attacks that occur in Australia each year put them off from doing something that they enjoy. Reports came in just days after the attack that Port Beach had been closed again. This time, a member of the public spotted a 3-meter shark circling the waters just 100 meters from shore. A surf life-saving helicopter was dispatched to patrol the area, but couldn't see anything. As for the 4 teenage boys who rushed to Paul's aid and warned others of the attack, they received bravery awards from the City of Fremantle and Civic Service Award medallions from the City of Melville. These awards recognize special service to the community. No doubt it took some time for the horror of what happened to sink in for the youngsters, but they were hailed as local heroes. Paul's wife was supported by officers. The only comfort she could take from the terrible and heart-wrenching tragedy was that her husband died doing what he loved. In May 2023, 18-year-old Cameron Robbins was attending his high school graduation ceremony. He had graduated from the University Laboratory School in Baton Rouge, Louisiana. Days later, he would be dead. He had attended the school for 13 years and had been a well-liked and well-respected pupil. He was devoted to his studies and was a fierce competitor on the baseball field, described as a star athlete. But the young man's bright future was about to come to a sudden and devastating end. To celebrate finishing school, Cameron and his friends headed to the Bahamas. Situated just off the coast of Florida, they are a popular destination for American tourists. Dozens of high school seniors flocked to the islands seeking adventure, relaxation, and a good time. They arrived at the incredible Atlantis Hotel on Paradise Island on the island of Nassau. Excitement was building as the youngsters explored the incredible location. They had studied hard, and now it was time to play hard. There was no time to unpack. Some of the students had organized a pirate-themed boat trip at sunset. They were going to have the party of their lives aboard a sailing ship as the sun went down. They boarded Blackbeard's Revenge that evening. Advertised as the only pirate ship in the Bahamas, the boat is an impressive 3-masted wooden sailing vessel that can be hired for private parties. It offers the use of a full cash bar and provides food on request. The music started up, the drinks were poured, and everyone chatted, laughed, and danced as they set sail from the mainland. But for Cameron, he would never set foot on the mainland again. He was about to walk the plank that night. As the alcohol flowed and the youngsters were enjoying themselves out on the open ocean, the weather closed in. The sun started to set and darkness descended over the water. There was a chill in the air, but the alcohol on the booze cruise warmed the passengers. The weather didn't dampen their spirits. The heavy thump of the bass beat, the noisy chatter of the students, all sent vibrations down through the boat's hull and into the water. The muffled sounds emanated across the sea and into the deep. When the boat reached Atoll Island at about 11:30 p.m., it began to turn around and head back to the mainland. Atoll Island lies less than a mile east of Paradise Island. It is uninhabited, and at 2 miles long, it's a popular spot for snorkeling in the National Marine Park. Despite the poor weather, most of those on board wore only their swimming costumes. As the chatter turned to banter, someone dared Cameron to jump off the boat. Was he man enough to do it? Was he brave enough? It was quite a jump into the dark waters below. The high sides of the sailing vessel were several feet above the surface of the ocean, but with the invincibility cloak that alcohol brings, Cameron accepted the challenge. He climbed up onto the ship's side and stood there, teetering on the edge. A few of his friends grabbed him and pulled him back down. He was being silly. He was drunk and careless. But he knew he could do it. He knew he could jump into the water and be back out again in seconds. He was up for the challenge. Whilst his friends tried to stop him, he broke free from their grip and ran back toward the side of the boat. Amidst cheers from the crowd, he leapt overboard in his swimming shorts. One of his friends filmed the jump on their phone. Everyone ran to the side of the boat and watched as Cameron splashed in the water. Someone shouted, "Bye-bye," as the 18-year-old drifted from the boat. He was surrounded by darkness, the black water below him, the black sky above him. But he wasn't alone in the water. Something circled him immediately. A friend threw him a life ring, but instead of swimming towards it, Cameron swam away. He was agitated about something. He had noticed a swirl in the water beside him. He kicked with his legs when something brushed past him. His friends on board Blackbeard's Revenge shouted at him to grab the buoy, but Cameron didn't respond. Fear gripped him as he tried to swim away from whatever it was in the water with him. In the darkness, people could see his white body in the water as he continually looked around nervously. Then he was engulfed by the darkness. Within seconds of entering the water, his friends lost sight of him. Had he been dragged underwater? They shouted for him, straining their eyes in the dark, but he didn't respond. Not a splash or a shout. Not a cry or a scream. He simply vanished into the blackness. The boat stayed until 2 or 3 in the morning searching for Cameron, but there was no sign of him. His friends grew frantic with worry. The Coast Guard was called and a search ensued. The people on board were cold and wet. They were tearful and afraid. Had they just seen the last of their classmate? As daylight broke the following day, an immense search was launched for Cameron. Had he drifted back to shore or onto one of the islands? The Royal Bahamas Defense Force conducted the search alongside the U.S. Coast Guard. Boats and planes were deployed to the area, covering hundreds of miles of ocean. Cameron's parents flew out to the Bahamas to assist in the operation, but after just 2 days, the search was called off. There was no way that Cameron could have survived that long in the sea. He wasn't wearing a life jacket, and the seas were known to be shark-infested. When officials played back the grainy mobile phone footage of Cameron jumping into the water, they spotted something terrifying. Just coming into shot as Cameron tread water appearing to be agitated, the outline of a shark emerged. It was just a few feet away from the team. It broke the surface of the water right in front of the youngster, its speed and agility visible from the split second in which it came toward Cameron. It darted away from him at the last moment, but Cameron had seen it. He knew he was in trouble and began swimming in the opposite direction. It also looks as though he is grabbed by something just out of sight, pulling him down under the water. That's the last his friends ever saw of him. Bull sharks are known to frequent the Bahamian waters. They are the most aggressive of their kind, and bulls are responsible for most of the fatal attacks that occur there. To those of us sitting at home watching this video, it's easy to say that Cameron was foolish to jump into the water that night. But he was a young man, celebrating his achievements and enjoying his time with his friends. And if he had thought about the dangers that lurked in the waters, if he had been told that that particular spot was known to be shark-infested, then he likely wouldn't have jumped. But in the moment, he was doing what many young people do, and that was fooling around, having fun and being daring at the same time. His family is obviously distraught at Cameron's death. No trace of him has ever been found. There is still speculation about whether a shark took him or whether the strong currents did. Either way, the haunting video that recorded his final moments is a chilling reminder of just how fragile life is. It began on the afternoon of Monday, the 3rd of July. On vacation with her family, a 15-year-old girl entered the water at Robert Moses Beach. She didn't know it at the time, but there was a predator lurking under the waves. As she paddled out into deeper water, a juvenile shark came closer. It was curious. The girl's body floated at the surface, her arms and legs dangling beneath her. The sunlight reflected off her skin. Typically, sharks determine what something is by taking a bite first. They get all their tactile information from mouthing the object. If it turns out to be something other than their typical prey, then they release their grip and swim away. That's what this young shark may have been doing. He could see the outline of the girl from beneath, the splashing on the surface of the water as she swam around. It sensed the vibrations of potential prey. The shark came in for an investigative bite. Opening its jaws at the last moment, it clamped down on her left leg. The girl gave a shriek and kicked furiously underwater. She could feel the sharp teeth dig into her calf, a vice-like grip around her lower leg. As the commotion unfolded, her struggles were spotted by a lifeguard who began blowing his whistle and running towards her. Seconds later, the shark released its grip and swam away. The girl swam to the shore, terrified of what had just happened. Blood oozed from the puncture wounds on her leg, and she sat down on the beach. When the lifeguard came to her aid, he immediately called for the beach to be closed. Although the girl didn't see what had bitten her, most believed this was a shark attack. Certainly a small shark, but nevertheless a shark attack all the same. The girl was taken to the hospital and went on to make a full recovery. No doubt she will think twice before entering the water again. But her incident was just the beginning. Another invisible attacker set its sights on the beachgoers. Just a few hours after the girl's attack at Robert Moses Beach, 15-year-old Peter Bankuli was riding the waves on his surfboard 3 miles to the east. He was in the surf at Kismet Beach. Under the cover of the breakers, another marine animal made its approach. Peter's left foot was dangling in the water off the back of his board while he waited for a wave. All of a sudden, he felt something grab hold of it. He knew immediately what it was. He felt the weight of it tug his foot downwards, but he held onto his surfboard firmly, refusing to let go, refusing to be pulled underwater. Moments later, the animal released its grip and swam away. Peter never saw what it was. He never saw the telltale dorsal fin or the gray back as it arched out of the water, but he was certain it was a shark. He was lucky. He managed to paddle to shore with the power of the waves pushing behind him, pushing him towards safety. When he reached the beach, he could assess the damage he had sustained properly. He called out to his friend Joe, who came rushing over. He and a member of the public helped stem the bleeding until emergency services arrived on the scene. Although slightly shocked by the incident, the young surfer says that he is not deterred from going back in the water, and once he makes a full recovery, that's exactly where he'll be headed. That's if the beaches are kept open. Following the 2 attacks, lifeguards scoured the coastline for sharks. They were on high alert. They knew the holidays were bringing more and more people to the beaches, and it was their duty to keep them safe. Using a drone, they searched for any sharks that may be prowling the shores. As the drone soared over the water, they spotted something that sent shivers down the spine. A school of 50 sand sharks were swimming just meters from the beach, just feet from where people were swimming. As holidaymakers splashed about in the shallows, they were unaware of the imminent danger. Although not thought of as sociable animals, some sharks have been observed hunting in packs. Could this have been a shark pack on the hunt, drawn to the beaches by the commotion of thousands of holidaymakers? In response to this sighting, beaches were closed, and news of the shark sighting spread like wildfire. Some people refused to step foot in the water. Others were undeterred. Panic set in amongst the beachgoers. The announcement of the alleged pack of sharks was condemned by shark experts. They said that it definitely would not have been a school of sharks patrolling the area. That behavior is very atypical of the alleged species, and the footage of the dark shadows was very poor. After consulting with lifeguards and the New York State Parks Department, it was confirmed that the shadowy school had been misidentified. They were likely a school of smaller fish, perhaps a school of black drum. Although the ominous shadow detected by the drones wasn't what people first feared, knowing that it was a large school of prey fish meant that sharks could be nearby, enticed into the shallows. Although no sharks had been spotted in the incidents so far, there was no doubt about the fact that there were sharks in the area, and holidaymakers were coming dangerously close to them. The following day, 3 more people were bitten just yards from the beaches. At Quoquay Village Beach, a public swimming beach in the town of Southampton, a 47-year-old entered the water. Schools of fish darted beneath the waves. Sharks were drawn in to just beyond the breakers. As the man waded out deeper and deeper, he had no idea that he was walking towards a predator. Moments later, in the chest-high water, he felt a sharp bite on his knee. Instantly, he kicked his leg and lashed out. He looked down but couldn't see anything in the water. He cried out in panic and rushed back to the shore. He could feel the pain growing in his leg as he made his way through the water to the shallows. He was taken to the hospital and treated for his injuries. No shark was sighted. As lifeguards were put on high alert, the mysterious bites kept coming. Minutes later, 60 miles away at Fire Island Pines, a 49-year-old who was swimming in the water felt a sharp tug on his hand. When he pulled his hand away, it was heavily lacerated and blood poured into the water. He too was taken to a nearby hospital and stitched up. That same day, a third attack occurred on a woman at Cherry Grove, located on Fire Island. Once more, beaches were closed and the coastline scoured for any signs of the shark or sharks. Drones took to the skies and lifeguards patrolled on jet skis. When no sharks were spotted, the beaches were reopened again with a warning to remain vigilant and close to shore. Had these bites been from sharks or had they been from another fish? There are other predatory fish that live in coastal waters. But a couple of days after the 4th of July celebrations, the ominous shadow of a 10-foot shark was seen weaving its way along the coastline, 50 feet from the beach. In 2 days, there had been 5 shark attacks. It was a significant number. In the previous year, Long Island had seen 8 attacks throughout the entire year, so it looked as though 2023 may be on course to beat that number. George Gorman, a state of New York park director in Long Island, said that there was cause for concern. He said that officials are stepping up surveillance to keep people safe, but it is worrying about the rising number of shark attacks. The warmer waters could be drawing the sharks closer to shore. As people continue to enjoy the marine environment, they are inevitably going to come in contact with the species that live there. Maybe next time, though, they may not be so lucky. Heidi Ernst was an avid scuba diver. She was very experienced in the underwater world. It was a passion of hers, the most enjoyable hobby, and at 73 years old, she certainly wasn't slowing down. In fact, in May 2023, she completed her 500th scuba dive, a milestone that few ever reach. She certainly had an appetite for adventure. At her home in Iowa, she was a devoted owner to her miniature schnauzer called Billy and her horse called Sunny. She was very physically fit, working as a physical therapist for almost 4 decades. Impressively, she was also a power lifter and exercise guru. In June 2023, just 1 month after her 500th scuba dive, she headed to the Bahamas, specifically Grand Bahama. Situated just 64 miles east of Florida's Palm Beach, the location is beautiful. Fringed by white flowery sands, palm trees, and turquoise blue waters, it's a stunning destination for holidaymakers. Not only that, but scuba diving in the Bahamas offers something for all diving abilities. Reef dives, shark dives, and wreck dives are popular across the islands and attract all manner of wildlife, least of all, sharks. It wasn't Heidi's first time in the Bahamas. She had been diving there for 11 years. The incredible marine wildlife and underwater photographic opportunities kept her coming back for more. On June 7th, Heidi boarded a 32-foot motorboat. The weather was warm and sunny. She wore her swimming costume and sat on the back of the boat, admiring the view as they motored toward the diving site, aptly named Shark Junction. The sea was relatively calm as they bounced along the waves. When they arrived at the location, the boat hovered over the dive site. Heidi pulled on her fins and dive gear. She rolled into the water and submerged in a cloud of bubbles. The brilliant blue of the ocean engulfed her. The beautiful marine wildlife spread across the reef below her. She swam downwards, watching the beautiful fish as they flitted and darted within the reef. She had her underwater camera with her, something she always did, capturing each adventure, each dive into the ocean. The dive had been a success. Heidi had seen what she came to see and headed for the surface. Looking up, she saw the silhouette of the boat above her. Gently, she glided upwards, kicking her fins back and forth, propelling herself closer to the boat. With her eyes fixed on the hull of the boat above her, Heidi failed to notice a shadow closing in. Below her, a tiger shark had been watching its potential prey swimming away. Its eyes locked onto the 73-year-old as she held onto the swim ladder at the back of the boat. Heidi pulled herself up the rungs of the ladder, pulling her mask off her face and removing her regulator from her mouth. If she had known she was being pursued by a top predator, then she would have leapt out of the water. If she had known what was about to happen, then maybe she could have pulled herself out of the water in time. But just as she was handing the boatman her mask, she felt a heavy tug on one of her legs. The power of the tug almost pulled her backwards into the water. It felt like a truck had hit her. She immediately looked down and saw the terrifying head of an enormous tiger shark. Its jaws were clamped firmly around her lower leg. She felt the searing pain as it thrashed its head from side to side. The water splashed and foamed. She knew she was in real danger of being pulled into the water, pulled into the jaws of an awesome predator. She needed to fight back to stay alive, so she held on to the rung of the ladder with one hand, and with the other, she hit the shark as hard as she could, on its head and on its nose. As Heidi continued to hit the shark, it let go, blood pouring from her gaping wound into the water. One of the boat's crew shouted at her to get out of the water. She didn't hesitate. She pulled herself up the ladder and scrambled onto the boat. As she looked down at her leg, it was serious. She was losing a lot of blood. One of the crew on board, Fred Reiger, administered first aid. He tied a tourniquet around her leg. Heidi could feel her life slipping away. She thought she was going to die. She thought this was the end. She had recently lost her husband to cancer just 3 years before, and now her family was going to have to say goodbye to her. But Fred secured the tourniquet as tightly as possible. It seemed to be working. It slowed the flow of blood. The bottom of the boat was stained in red, which swirled around as the boat rocked from side to side. They motored full speed back to shore. The pain was excruciating as Heidi lay in the boat, hoping upon hope that she would make it. In the 11 years that Heidi had been diving, she had never felt threatened by any sharks she had come across. They had never shown any signs of aggression as Heidi snapped photos of them swimming around her. They were part of the marine environment, and she had swum with many of them before. She knew the dangers, and she knew how to behave around them. This attack had taken her completely by surprise. When the boat made it back to shore, Heidi was rushed to Rand Memorial Hospital in Grand Bahama's Freeport. Once she was there, she was stabilized before being airlifted to Jackson Ryder Trauma Center in Miami. She was conscious when she arrived and discussed her options with surgeons. They were limited. The wound on her calf was severe. The surgeons didn't know if they could save the leg, but they could try. If they were successful, then it could be a long, arduous road ahead of her with constant threat of infection and poor use of the limb. Heidi made the decision to have her leg amputated from the shin down. She would likely recover faster that way. It was a shock, but it seemed to be the right decision. In the days that followed Heidi's amputation, she received 6 or 7 blood transfusions and 6 surgeries. A specialist reconnected the nerves in her lower leg to her muscles with the hope of reducing pain and improving recovery. Heidi still has a long road ahead of her. She will likely need more procedures as she recovers, but for now, she is hopeful. A GoFundMe page was set up by Heidi's friend Kimberly Barnes to help cover her medical expenses and travel costs. Over a week after the attack, Heidi was still in the hospital in Miami. She hadn't been discharged and hadn't made it home to Iowa. When she eventually made it home, Heidi remained positive. She hasn't been deterred from diving and has been researching prosthetic diving fins for amputees. Her passion for marine wildlife is etched into her very being. She isn't going to give it up that easily. When animals attack, the stories make headlines across the world. People are shocked and horrified when they hear about encounters with the Earth's apex predators, but they are also mesmerized. There's something fascinating about these stories, something that grips our attention. It's little wonder why we fear these animals. They've been built up to be dangerous, mindless predators that will attack unprovoked whenever they're given the chance. Mark was a videographer for a shark cage diving company in South Africa. As a Brit, Mark wasn't used to diving with great whites off the UK coast, but he had been working as a videographer in South Africa for some time. He photographed the tourists who had paid to witness the sharks up close. The dive company operated out of Mossel Bay on South Africa's southern cape. The bay and the surrounding area are teeming with marine wildlife. The waters are full of fish, seals, whales, penguins, dolphins, and of course, sharks. It's considered by some to be the best place in the world to see great white sharks, and tourists flock there for a thrill-seeking adventure. In July 2023, Mark boarded the boat full of tourists and they motored out to sea from Kleinbrack Beach. The choppy waves made for a bumpy ride, but the 31-year-old was used to it. He had done this dozens of times before. What better job in the world than being paid to swim with sharks? When they reached the site, the crew cut the engine and lowered the cage into the water, its top sticking out above the surface of the sea. The tourists began to prepare themselves for entering the open ocean. They pulled on masks and snorkels. The water was murky, visibility was poor, but the sharks were out there and they were coming their way. It wasn't long before the tourists got their first taste of adventure. Their hearts thundered in their chests as the shadowy image of a great white shark emerged before them. The shark circled the boat. From the deck, the crew could see the characteristic shape of the great white below. Its dorsal fin slicing through the water's surface, its tail propelling it slowly forward as it inspected the boat and the people in the cage. It glided slowly by, carefree in its movements, but with an incredible power capable of being unleashed at any second. Mark strapped his GoPro Hero to his head and submerged beneath the waves. He sank beside the cage on the outside of the bars and pressed the record button on his camera. The shark swam around the cage. It circled the tourists and thrashed in the water as it took chunks of meat that were thrown from the boat in front of the paying guests. Mark continued to record. Despite the poor visibility, the footage was good. The customers loved to watch back their experience and show their friends just how close they came to one of nature's greats, but none came quite as close as Mark. As he was filming, one of the sharks turned and swam directly toward him. The tourists inside the cage held their breaths, their eyes opened wide. Was the hungry shark, already enticed by the taste of fresh blood, going to take a bite from Mark? Was he going to be next? Mark stayed calm. He had been in this situation before. He marveled at the incredible animal before him. Its huge head and body. Its mouth was slightly agape, revealing its razor-sharp teeth as it came towards him. He could see the pink flesh inside its jaws, but it showed no aggression at all. It was merely curious, swimming gently toward the young cameraman. He could likely sense the electrical pulses from the GoPro and wanted to investigate. It swam up to Mark and nibbled the camera on top of his head. Its teeth were almost touching his skin, and still Mark remained absolutely calm. He knew the shark wasn't there to attack him. After mouthing the camera briefly, the shark then nudged it with its nose before swimming away. The encounter, caught on camera, was about as close as you can get to a shark without being eaten. But it showed a completely different side to these animals. It wasn't the monster that they have so often been made out to be. They aren't mindless eating machines. They don't eat everything in their path. They can be curious and timid. They can be gentle and inquisitive. Although the incredible footage shows a softer side to sharks, people are fascinated by the video. The diver's head is just a centimeter from the animal's jaws, and with one lunge forward, the shark could have grabbed Mark with its razor-sharp teeth. But it didn't, and that's a lesson for us all. Sharks are known to mouth objects to help them determine what they are. It's their way of feeling. Their snouts are incredibly sensitive, and often they'll take a small bite to see if the object is potential prey or not. This is why human-shark interactions often involve one bite before the shark swims away without pursuing the attack. But all too often, these so-called small bites prove fatal for humans because the shark is such a powerful animal. Mark's recent encounter that has been shared across social media many times may soon be a thing of the past. In the last few years, South Africa has seen a significant decline in great white sharks off its coast. Research has shown that there are thought to be just 333 individuals that swim in the waters off South Africa. Mark's shark was an individual from this single population of great white sharks, a dwindling population. So why are great white sharks leaving South Africa? Some have suggested that the only predator powerful enough, big enough, and brave enough to take on a great white shark is responsible. Orcas, or killer whales, are known to hunt sharks, and their thriving numbers can have a significant impact on local shark populations. But others are skeptical. They don't believe orcas are to blame because usually after orcas sweep through an area, demolishing great whites, the shark numbers bounce back relatively quickly. Other factors are likely to be at play. Firstly, South Africa's shark nets, which have been deployed along stretches of the coastline to protect swimmers, result in considerable deaths of marine wildlife. Not only are sharks caught in the nets, but other animals, including the shark's prey, die from entanglement in the nets. This adds to the decline in shark numbers in South African waters. Furthermore, their food source is becoming scarce. Unsustainable harvesting of smoothhound and soupfin sharks between 2016 and 2019 had a knock-on effect throughout the food chain. These two smaller shark species are prey for great whites, but that's not all. Changes in biodiversity due to overfishing led to unmaintained kelp forests, which created an impenetrable barrier. Sharks were unable to access their other main source of prey, fur seals. These seals sought refuge in the shallow bays on the other side of the kelp. As a result, the predominant prey species are dwindling or inaccessible, therefore the sharks are moving elsewhere to find food. A once iconic species off South Africa's Cape, great white sharks may only be seen in footage like that from Mark's GoPro in the future, unless we can find a way to conserve this vital species. It was a beautiful Sunday afternoon in 2014. Three friends, Cliff Zimmerman, Red Bartley, and Randy Fry, met for lunch at Kareen's Fish Grotto in the center of town at Fort Bragg. Situated along California's coastline in Mendocino County, the three men were eager fishermen and decided to head out for the afternoon on Cliff's boat. By mid-afternoon, they decided to try a spot of abalone diving. Cliff turned the boat back to shore and motored into a sheltered cove at Kaipsilla Rock. Sea lions swam around the boat. Some were lying, sunning themselves on the large semi-submerged rocks. They were 150 feet from shore, and the depth gauge read 15 feet. Although it was a popular fishing spot, the little cove was only accessible by boat. The steep, jagged cliffs cast a dark shadow over the water. No one else was about. They had the cove all to themselves. Once there, the men dropped the anchor by a large boulder. Cliff and Randy pulled on their wetsuits, dive masks, and fins. It was around 4 p.m. on the 15th of August 2014 when Randy and Cliff entered the water on what was to be their last dive together. They had been friends for more than 30 years. Having met in the construction industry in Sacramento during the 1970s, the two men discovered they had a mutual interest in ocean diving. Randy spent all his spare time on the water, whether that was for sport fishing or diving for abalone. Randy and Cliff hit it off and became great friends, often traveling to the coast together for their diving adventures, sitting on the beach after their dives, drinking beer and talking until the sun went down. Randy had been described as someone who lived his life carefree. Later in life, he made a career as a lobbyist for the Recreational Fishing Alliance. Fishing and diving were his passions. He loved the sea so much that he had often said to Cliff that if he had to go, then he would want it to be in the water. Unfortunately for Randy, that wish was about to come true as, at 50 years old, he met his premature end. With sea lions in the area, Cliff and Randy spoke to Red about sharks. He was told to keep lookout from the boat. If he was to see sea lions acting erratically or anxiously, then he must let them know straight away. Red was a bit worried when he heard this, but his friends assured him that they had been diving together for more than 30 years in these waters, and nothing was going to happen. Red maintained a lookout as his two friends floated on the surface of the water just yards from the boat. He watched as Randy and Cliff gulped in a lungful of air and submerged below the surface. They scoured the ocean floor for the marine mollusk, abalone, looking for the characteristic oval-shaped shells clinging to the rocks. Situated just 170 miles north of San Francisco, the water off Fort Bragg was frequented by sharks. Northern California has a healthy great white shark population. Conservationists and marine biologists estimate there is a growing number of around 300 individuals, signaling a healthy marine ecosystem off the West Coast. Randy, Cliff, and Red knew that sharks frequented the area, but it didn't deter them from diving. They had been in the water with sharks before, and they had never shown any interest in the divers. It irritated Randy when people warned of the dangers of sharks. He knew the odds of being killed on the way to the beach were hundreds of times greater than actually being taken by a shark. In fact, the odds were so long that only 9 people had been killed by great whites off the Californian coast since records began. But those odds were about to catch up to Randy. Swimming in just 15 feet of water, the two friends could see the bottom of the sea below them as they dived down repeatedly, resurfacing frequently for air. They moved towards the kelp beds, where the long strands of seaweed reached for the surface, swaying with the motion of the sea, a forest of brown and dark green. The two of them floated on the surface. Then Randy said to Cliff, "I've got to get a couple of abs. Where are they?" To which Cliff replied, "They're right below me." Randy took a deep gulp of air and dived down, straight into the path of an incoming predator. Cliff sunk his face underwater and watched his friend. The two of them were just 3 feet apart when Cliff noticed something out of the corner of his eye. Immediately, he thought that it was a boat zooming overhead at tremendous speed. But then he felt the water move around him. He saw a flash of dark gray and an enormous shark fin slice through the water between him and his dive buddy. It was like a submarine coming out of nowhere, barreling in between the two of them. Cliff couldn't believe the size of it, as he estimated it to be around 18 feet long and built like a pickup truck. With such speed and power, the two men didn't have time to react. It swooped past Cliff, its eyes fixated on his friend, not much more than an arm's length away. Cliff felt the rough sandpapery skin brush him as it torpedoed past. Time seemed to stand still. His heart thumped hard at the realization of what this enormous gray body was. His eyes opened wide, and within a second, the great white shark had powered into the unsuspecting Randy. He may not have even seen it, as he was looking down at the seafloor at the time. He would have felt an immense smack from behind him, like being hit by a truck. As quickly as it appeared, it closed its powerful jaws around Randy's neck, thrashed its head from side to side, and yanked Randy's head clean off from his body. Cliff screamed underwater as the nightmare unfolded right before his eyes. Cliff was terrified that the shark would turn on him. He didn't dare look back. He didn't dare dip his mask below the surface to see if it was coming for him. Instead, he swam as hard as he could toward the boat. He headed for the little platform at the stern of the boat and yelled at Reb to grab him and pull him as hard as he could. He didn't want to be the guy who nearly made it. Red grabbed him and hauled him on board. Cliff lay on the floor of the boat for a few seconds, gasping for air, panting hard, completely shocked by what he had seen. Then he and Red peered back over the side of the boat. It was evident from the amount of blood surrounding the scene of the attack that their friend Randy was gone. Red then grabbed the radio. He squeezed the button and relayed his distress mayday message to the Coast Guard. Within minutes, 3 helicopters were hovering above the cove, and the Coast Guard boat was motoring to the scene. A search for Randy's body began. Their friend was dead within seconds. There was no chance of survival, and the two friends knew it, but they needed to find his body. It wasn't until the next day that Randy's body was recovered from the water. The shark hadn't eaten him. It had likely mistaken him for a seal and swam away after making the fatal blow. Randy's head washed ashore 3 weeks later, discovered by a beachcomber. It was a gruesome and terrifying incident which left his friends and family devastated and shocked. His death was incredibly quick, and he likely had no idea what was happening when the shark struck him. Randy was cremated and a memorial service was held on board 2 fishing boats. Out in the sea, the place where Randy felt most comfortable, his ashes were scattered. His final resting place. One of the world's largest cruise ships, Harmony of the Seas, owned by Royal Caribbean, offers unforgettable experiences for its passengers. With swimming pools, climbing walls, and zip lines on board, to fine dining restaurants, spas, and a fitness center, the incredible cruise ship has something for everybody as it island hops through the Caribbean. With a capacity of more than 6,500 passengers, Harmony of the Seas must ensure that each and every one is kept safe. But when its customers climb off the ship and enter the water, safety cannot be guaranteed. One of the most popular activities offered by many cruise ships is the chance to go snorkeling at one of the many places where they moor up. And where better to do that than in the crystal clear waters of the Caribbean? On Sunday, September 4th, 2022, Caroline Diplacido and 4 of her family members boarded the ship at Port Canaveral in Florida and set sail for a 7-day cruise. Caroline lived and worked in Erie, Pennsylvania. She had attended Gannon University as a student, and now at the age of 58, she worked there. She was certainly well known and well liked, described as a powerful presence of kindness and friendship to colleagues, students, and the wider community. She and her husband David had 3 children, Allison, Robert, and David. She loved having a full house. She loved having the children's friends over when they were younger, a constant revolving door as people came and went. This cruise was a holiday that the family had been looking forward to for a long time, and now the time had come. 2 days after leaving Florida, the ship moored up just off Nassau on the island of New Providence. Nassau, the capital of the Bahamas, is famed not only for its beautiful beaches, but also for its coral reefs, which entice snorkelers and divers to view the incredible marine wildlife. It was Tuesday afternoon on September 6th, and Caroline and her family left the cruise ship to join an independent company for a snorkeling adventure. They had booked the excursion weeks before joining the cruise ship. Their destination was Rose Island, known by some locals for its sharks that are drawn to the reefs and their prey that live amongst the coral. Only 3 years earlier in 2019, a young American tourist was killed just off Rose Island by at least 3 tiger sharks that pounced on her as she snorkeled in the clear waters. She was a 21-year-old university student, Jordan Lindsay, who was on her 3rd day of a family holiday. Tragically, the family decided on a last-minute snorkeling trip that cost the youngster her life. Her mother heard her yell out, "Mom!" and when she looked around, she thought her daughter was surrounded by dolphins. But the dorsal fins slicing through the water weren't from animals that were there to play. They belonged to a trio of tiger sharks. Suddenly, one ripped Jordan's arm from her body. She screamed, and her mother swam to her rescue. But as she was fighting off one shark, she heard her daughter yell out again, "Mom, there's another one coming!" And the 3rd shark struck Lindsay again. She had been bitten all over her body. She had lost her arm, and she was drifting in and out of consciousness as she was hauled into a motorboat. Sadly, the young student lost her life before making it to the hospital. Now, 3 years later, Caroline entered the water in almost exactly the same spot. The sunshine glittered and glimmered off the sea. The visibility underwater was good. The clear sea was inviting. After pulling on a mask and snorkel, Caroline floated at the surface with her face underneath. The beautiful corals were beneath her, with brightly colored fish darting about. Sea urchins clung to the rocks. Sea anemones waved in the gentle motion of the sea. The muffled sounds of the underwater world filled her ears. But there was danger nearby. A top predator was closing in on the reef. Swimming along the drop-off where fish accumulated, it sensed prey was nearby. Drawn by the vibrations, sounds, and smells, it moved closer, propelling itself through the water with its powerful tail. A hunting machine. An opportunistic hunter, a bull shark. Bull sharks join tiger sharks and great whites as the three most dangerous species of shark. They are naturally aggressive and inquisitive and frequent warm coastal waters. For this reason, they are responsible for a number of attacks on humans each year. They typically eat fish, but will also prey on dolphins and even other sharks. Unprovoked, they can bite a human to determine if it's prey or not, but all too often, that initial bite can be fatal. This particular bull shark spotted Caroline at the surface. She floated above, her body silhouetted against the bright afternoon sunshine. The shark came in from below. The power of the strike would have knocked the air from her lungs. Some describe it as feeling like being hit by a bus. Caroline felt the full force of the attack as it smacked into her. It clamped its jaws around the side of Caroline's torso, locking its teeth onto its prey. Caroline let out a yell, and her family looked up. They could see the attack unfolding. They could see the water bubbling and boiling around Caroline as she wrestled with the shark. Then it let go. A moment of thrashing around, a single bite. That's all it took for the damage to be done. Rushing to her aid, Caroline's family pulled her from the water. She had lost a lot of blood. The trauma to her left side was severe. A large bite taken out of her torso. She was rushed by the tour boat to nearby Fort Montague on the eastern shore of New Providence Island. In the boat, her family tried to stem the bleeding. Crew members tried to revive her as she was now unresponsive. Her daughter tried to keep her alive. She tried to resuscitate her, but tragically, Caroline was pronounced dead when she arrived on the island. Obviously, it was an incredibly shocking incident for the family. They lost a wonderful member of their family that day. A mother, wife, grandmother, sister, and auntie. The dream holiday had come crashing down to a devastating and tragic end. Shark attacks in the Bahamas are happening more often now. The chances of being attacked by a shark still remain incredibly rare, a likelihood of around 1 in 3 million. But in 2019 alone, there were 2 shark attacks in Bahamian waters, one of them fatal. Since 1749, there have been 32 reported shark attacks in those waters, compared to just 13 in nearby Cuba. Most of the shark attacks in the Caribbean are centered around the Bahamas. Marine biologists say this is because of the large number of people who venture into the water there, and the fact that the Bahamas has a robust ecosystem with a healthy population of sharks. Caroline will be sorely missed by all who knew her. She was a powerful presence of kindness and friendship. She was described as a person whose caring gestures were limited only by the number of hours in a day. On August 25, 2023, Toby Begg headed down to the water at Lighthouse Beach, south of Port Macquarie, on Australia's New South Wales coast. He was wearing his black wetsuit, just like he often did. He stepped down onto the sand and walked toward the surf with his bright blue surfboard under his arm. The conditions were lovely. The sun was shining and the water was warm. 6 others were in the water, enjoying their Friday morning surf. But just a few minutes later, Toby's life would change forever. Toby was a 44-year-old father of 2. He worked in the building trade, running his own business. He was a fit individual who used to work for the fire service. He enjoyed the outdoors and the surf. Living on Australia's east coast meant that the surf beaches were never far away. At the time, Toby joined 6 others in the ocean. He paddled out beyond the breakers to about 150 meters offshore. As he sat on his board, his legs dangling in the water and the tip of his board lifting up above the surface, something moved towards him. The morning sunlight shimmered off the glassy sea as Toby looked for the next wave to catch. A photographer on the beach was scouring the water for dolphins at the time. He rotated his camera lens to zoom in on the surfers and snapped a shot. It was a photograph that would later send chills down the spine. Unbeknown to the photographer, he had just captured the moment before Toby's life would change forever. It was an apparently unremarkable photo, but look a little closer and it's possible to see a patch of disturbed water directly behind a bodyboarder and just feet away from Toby. The 2 men glanced down at that second. That's when it dawned on them that they were within feet of a great white shark. Measuring a massive 4 meters or 13 feet long, its tail swished from side to side, just inches below the surface, causing the water to boil slightly, disturbing the water just enough for the two men to notice. But rather than swim past the two men, it launched an attack a second later. It grabbed hold of Toby, tearing into his legs. He gripped his surfboard with all his might, refusing to be dragged underwater. When he cried out, the other surfers swam to his aid. As the shark tugged on his legs and thrashed its head from side to side, Toby's legs were torn open. Muscle was ripped from bone as the serrated teeth crunched down. Toby tried to kick the shark away, but it had his legs firmly in its jaws. Each time Toby smacked the shark with his fist, the shark readjusted its grip. It released him momentarily and then came back for more. It was determined to secure a meal, but not as determined as Toby was to survive. The water bubbled and boiled around him, a commotion of dark gray shark fins. Toby in his bright blue surfboard. He splashed about in the water, frantically fighting the huge giant off. Horrified onlookers could only watch as he tried to push the shark away and tried to keep himself above the surface. At one point, it looked like a losing battle as the seconds ticked by. It was a prolonged and sustained attack. The agonizing ordeal went on for more than 30 seconds. 30 seconds in which Toby refused to give up. Eventually, the shark released him and swam away. The 44-year-old scrambled back onto his board and with the help of the others around him, paddled to shore. A blood trail lingered behind him, tainting the blue waters. Lauren Enfield, who was also surfing at the time and witnessed the horrific sequence of events, rushed to the beach to call for help. She ran up to a mother and daughter who were on the sand to alert them of what had just happened, and they immediately called the emergency services. When Toby made it to shore, he could see the extent of his injuries, and he collapsed on the sand. Witnesses rushed to his side. One teenage girl stood and stared, shocked by what she saw. Toby's wetsuit was torn and tattered. The sand turned red around his body. He didn't respond to those around him. He was frozen. His eyes were fixed in a stare. She could see his foot had been severed from one leg, and a devastating gash had ripped the leg from the hip all the way down to his calf. The other leg was badly mauled below the knee. His bright blue surfboard had been snapped in two, with puncture marks and teeth marks scraped along the paintwork. Incredibly, there was an emergency doctor on the beach at the time who rushed to help. The quick actions of those around Toby may have just saved his life. They grabbed his surfboard cord and wrapped it around one of his legs to form a tourniquet. They used sticks as a makeshift splint to hold the leg straight and waited for emergency responders to arrive. He was rushed to Port Macquarie Base Hospital. He arrived in critical condition, but doctors managed to stabilize him. They were unable to save his most badly damaged leg. The decision was made to airlift him by the Westpac rescue helicopter to John Hunter Hospital in Newcastle. There, surgeons tried desperately to save the other leg. At the time of making this video, Toby was in a stable but serious condition. His brother-in-law set up a GoFundMe page to help the family through the temporary loss of the main breadwinner. He had undergone several surgeries at the hospital, and the road to recovery would be long and painful. From the size and shape of the bite marks on Toby's board, and from what witnesses described, it's been assumed that the species involved was a great white shark. Great whites have been spotted along that stretch of coastline the previous day, and smart drum lines used to catch sharks had caught 3 sharks that day, including one at Lighthouse Beach. The smart drum lines are baited lines attached to a GPS alert system. It sends a signal when an animal has been caught on the line. Authorities then race to the line that's been triggered and drag the animal, ideally a shark, offshore to at least 3,000 feet, where it's then released. Critics say that there's a significant amount of bycatch caught on the lines, such as leatherback turtles, and having baited lines offshore only entices predators, like sharks, closer to the beaches. Furthermore, as this incident proves, drumlines don't catch all sharks in the area, and human-shark encounters still occur at beaches where drumlines have been deployed. At the time of making this video in September 2023, there have been 7 shark attacks in Australian waters this year. In some parts of the world, such as along South Africa's KwaZulu-Natal coastline, Shark nets have been installed. These may be more effective at deterring sharks, but they often kill large numbers of both sharks and other marine animals. Although shark attacks make headlines across the world and can devastate the lives of those involved, being bitten by a shark is still incredibly unlikely, given the number of people who enter the water each day. Beachport sea urchins and slugs are a group of locals who enjoy swimming in the seas off South Australia. They meet every morning at 7:30, come rain or shine. Dipping into the sea that early is a refreshing start to the day and an enjoyable way to stay fit. Beachport is situated 200 miles southeast of Adelaide. It's a small coastal town and a popular fishing spot, but it's most famous for its jetty. Built in the late 1800s, the jetty measures 772 meters, 2,533 feet long. Its wooden slats and white painted railings disappear into Rivoli Bay. Those that walk along it can see the golden sandy beaches stretching along the coastline. It's the perfect place to swim and fish from. But on the morning of October 2nd, 2023, there was another fish swimming around the jetty, one with a deadly appetite, an opportunistic hunter on the prowl for an easy meal. Swimming from Beachport Beach around the jetty and back again was something that 64-year-old Pamela Cook had been doing for more than a decade. She had some heart issues, and swimming was a great way to keep her heart healthy. She swam each morning before her shift at the local Beachport Hotel began. It set her up for the day, but just before 8 a.m., disaster struck. Pamela waded into the water with her group of friends. There were about a dozen of them. The sea was calm, the conditions perfect for their early morning swim. When she reached waist height, she kicked off with her legs and began on the route toward the end of the wooden jetty. As she rounded the structure, she suddenly felt a sharp tug on her ankle. She instinctively kicked away, thinking it was one of the other swimmers clashing with her leg behind her or playing a prank. But then she noticed a dark shadow come around the side of her, and her heart leapt. She realized that the tug on her ankle had in fact been a shark bite. Seconds later, the juvenile great white shark swung around. Its jaws opened wide, its rows of sharp teeth on display as its head broke through the surface of the water. The bite on the ankle had been a test, and Pamela had passed the test. The shark surfaced right next to her, and Pamela could see its dark eyes as the gray head lunged forward. She didn't have time to react. She didn't have time to swim away. The shark clamped its jaws around Pamela's thigh, and she let out a terrified yell. At that moment, all she could think about was a family friend of theirs, Jared Stebbins, who was fatally attacked by a shark in 2005. She knew this was serious and that she may not live to tell the tale. But she wasn't going down without a fight. She punched the snout over and over again, trying to push the shark off her. She could feel the intense pressure of the jaws around her upper leg. She was trapped and couldn't break free. In the scrap, her hand and arm were torn by the razor's sharp teeth as the shark thrashed its head from side to side. Two other swimmers near Pamela heard her cries for help and saw the commotion unfolding. They could see Pamela kicking furiously, the water splashing and frothing all around her. They immediately swam to her aid and yelled at some construction workers on the jetty. They held on to Pamela, promising not to let go, keeping her afloat and trying desperately to get the shark to let go. And then the shark miraculously released its grip. Pamela could feel the release and pressure, but she was by no means out of the water yet. Maintenance worker Greg Ray, who was working on the jetty at the time, immediately leapt into action. He and some colleagues could see the women in the water screaming for help, and they grabbed their first aid and trauma kits and rushed to the edge of the jetty. By the time they reached the end of the jetty, Pamela was being helped up the ladder and out of the water by her fellow swimmers. They hauled her up. Pamela's husband Greg was buying a coffee when he received the phone call. He couldn't believe it when Pamela's friend on the other end of the phone explained that she had been attacked by a shark. He rushed to the scene. The shark had torn a gash out of Pamela's thigh. Blood poured from the open wound. Her friends lay her down, and worker Greg Ray immediately tied a tourniquet around her upper leg. When he pulled it tight, the bleeding slowed. Two other witnesses, locals Silvana and Michelle Jewell, who heard that there was a shark attack, raced toward the end of the jetty. They pulled out their mobile phones and immediately dialed the emergency services. It was a race against time. One of Pamela's friends took off her shirt and tied it around another wound on Pamela's arm to stem the bleeding. Keeping her calm was one of the main priorities. There was a real threat that she may go into shock. Her friends and bystanders kept her talking, reassuring her that the ambulance was on its way. That was all they could do. They had performed all the emergency first aid they could. They now had to just hope that the emergency services arrived in time to take over. By now, her husband Greg had arrived and knelt down by her side. When the paramedics arrived, those surrounding Pamela helped her lie on a spinal board and rush her to the waiting ambulance. She was driven to Mount Gambier Hospital, about 85 kilometers from Beachport. Pamela was rushed into emergency surgery to try and save her leg. She received 200 stitches in her thigh, arm, and hand. She was lucky to be alive, and by the evening, her husband reported that she was in stable condition. Pamela, at 65 years old, was a grandmother, the matriarch of the family. In her hospital bed, she was surrounded by her loved ones. And although it was early yet, it didn't take long before she decided that she would go back into the water. It may not be right away, but she knew she would get out there again. She didn't want her life to be ruled by fear, and her love for swimming in the sea had given her so much over the years that she couldn't bear the thought of giving it up. As news spread of the horrible attack, locals were in shock. There had never been anything like it in the area before. The swimming group had been performing the same swim every morning for the past 30 years. They were terrified that they may have just witnessed their friend's final moments as they anxiously waited for news from the hospital. While Pamela was rushed off and into surgery, crew members from the state emergency service began scouring the water for the shark. They flew Phantom 4 drones 800 meters offshore and 500 meters north and south of the jetty all afternoon. By the following morning, no sign of the shark had been spotted. Pamela's attack was the 7th serious attack in the country that same year. It came just weeks after surfer Toby Begg lost his leg to a shark attack along the New South Wales coast at Port Macquarie. Earlier in the year, schoolteacher Simon Baccanello was tragically killed in a shark attack off South Australia's west coast. Every year, there are on average 23 shark attacks in Australian waters. 2 or 3 of these prove fatal. It's a risk that swimmers, surfers, and divers put themselves at every time they enter the water. But considering how many people enjoy water sports along the coastlines, shark attacks are still incredibly rare. And this time, Pamela was incredibly lucky. From an early age, Rodney Fox was drawn to the sea. Born in 1940 and growing up in Adelaide, South Australia, he regularly went fishing with his father. But his real passion was for spearfishing. As a teen, he was often rewarded for his efforts with fresh catches of lobster and fish, much to his family's delight. At the age of 22, he became the South Australian spearfishing champion, a title that earned him respect amongst fellow fishermen and one he was proud of. Things were going well for the youngster. A year later, he married the love of his life, Kay. But just 4 months after their wedding, their lives were about to be turned upside down. While competing in the 1963 South Australian Spearfishing Championships, he suffered the worst non-fatal shark attack in history. The extent of his injuries were so horrific, many consider it a miracle he survived. On a crisp December day, down by Aldinga Beach, just south of Adelaide, things were getting a bit tense. Sharks were on everyone's mind. Boats bobbed on the water, keeping a watchful eye on divers and their slippery trophies. It had been 4 long hours of competition, and the sea now told a grim tale, with a trail of fishy blood and guts drifting away on the outgoing tide. If any sharks were lurking nearby, that scent buffet was sure to get their attention. Out there, you had 40 folks chasing underwater glory, and the clock was ticking. Just 1 hour left in the championship. Rodney had a clear goal: bag a dusky Morwong fish to secure his back-to-back win. He decided to take the plunge, venturing beyond the protective reef. The water was about 60 feet deep, and as Rodney went down, there was a weird stillness in the water. like the calm before a storm. Then, bam, it hit him like a freight train. A massive great white shark slammed into his left side, knocking the wind out of him and sending him hurtling through the water like a human torpedo. Rodney knew exactly what was happening. He could feel those razor-sharp teeth clamping down hard. His mask got ripped away, and his world turned into a blurry nightmare. As Rodney's body was ruthlessly compressed, his insides shifted violently, and the precious air dwindled rapidly. Dragged 30 feet beneath the turbulent surface, the world above dimmed, and the cold abyss enveloped him. Amidst this underwater turmoil, he frantically groped in the darkness, driven by a desperate quest to locate the shark's eye, a whispered strategy he had recently discussed with a friend. His trembling fingers finally found their target, plunging into the shark's eye socket with a surge of adrenaline-fueled determination. Instantly, the shark relinquished its grip, yet as the relentless pressure receded, it unleashed a wave of excruciating pain coursing through Rodney's battered body. In a final bid to ward off the relentless predator, he pushed with his right hand, only to find it devoured by the shark's gaping maw. But Rodney's sole instinct was survival. He had to claw his way back to the surface, to the life-sustaining breaths that beckoned above. Yet lurking just behind, the shark pursued him relentlessly, its snout nipping at his flippers. It knew its quarry was wounded, and hunger fueled its relentless pursuit. As Rodney erupted through the water surface, greedily inhaling life-saving breaths, he sensed the sandpaper-like rasp of the shark's skin brushing against his leg. He knew it was returning for a second onslaught. Swiftly, before the predator could swivel and strike once more, Rodney latched onto its dorsal side, engaging in an adrenaline-charged wrestle with the colossal great white. With sheer determination, Rodney clung to the shark's body, aware that as long as he held on, its formidable jaws wouldn't clamp down on him. Below the surface, a fierce underwater struggle unfolded. They brushed perilously against jagged rocks and tangled in swaying seaweed, the battleground for their life-and-death duel. Yet as seconds ticked away, Rodney's precious air reserves dwindled once more. Reluctantly, he released his tenacious grip, making a desperate dash for the surface. As he broke the surface and into the open air, the cool breeze caressed his face, and he gulped in life-sustaining oxygen. With his remaining strength, Rodney managed to force out a bone-chilling cry, a single word that still reverberates with terror in his memory. Shark! And what he witnessed next, as he gazed upon the unfathomable depths, would forever haunt his dreams. Through the red cloud of his own blood, he saw the shark's head emerge right next to his own blood-soaked body. Its jaws were open, its snout rounded and gray. A feeling of indescribable terror flooded his veins. Rodney kicked at it for all that he was worth. It rushed at him once more, but missed him by millimeters. Instead, it grabbed a mouthful of Rodney's float, which was attached to his waist. The shark thrashed its head from side to side and dived deep underwater, dragging Rodney with it. Pulled by the rope attached to the float inside the shark's mouth, Rodney felt he was going to drown. As he was pulled for 10 or 12 meters, he thought how unfair it would be to die by drowning, having survived the initial attack. He fumbled with the belt around his waist, trying desperately to break free from the rope, but his fingers weren't working properly. He couldn't see clearly, and he was losing huge amounts of blood. Then, miraculously, the rope suddenly snapped under the pressure. As he reached the air, a boat was waiting for him. The crew hauled him on board, but they knew not to take off his wetsuit. It was the only thing holding him together. When they made it to dry land, Rodney was rushed to the hospital in Adelaide in a private car. The ambulance met them en route. The speed at which he received treatment was key to his survival. He was inside the hospital receiving treatment within an hour of the attack. The extent of Rodney's injuries would normally be considered unsurvivable. It took some time for Rodney to overcome his fear of sharks. Although he competed in the following year's spearfishing championships again and scored the highest points in 3 of the 4 categories, he was still struggling to keep his fear at bay. A renowned fisherman, Alf Dean, who held the record for catching the largest fish with rod and line, took Rodney out fishing with him one day. Alf expertly caught 5 sharks that day and hauled them onto dry land to show off his catch. But Rodney was less than impressed. Seeing the animals dead on the sand wasn't what he wanted. He didn't want revenge on the sharks. He wanted to understand them. After a visit to Adelaide Zoo with his wife Kay and seeing a caged lion, he came up with an idea: to build a cage that could be lowered into the water to view sharks safely. With the metal bars protecting him from the shark's powerful jaws, he would be able to observe them up close and maybe come to terms with what happened to him. And so, shark cage diving was born. Rodney filmed the sharks underwater. It was the first time this had been done and attracted global attention. But seeing the animals through the camera lens and behind the safety of the metal bars, Rodney, and indeed the world, could see that sharks weren't the fearsome, cold-blooded killers they had been made out to be. In fact, they were extremely cautious animals that were more fascinated by the bait dangling in the water than the humans in the cage. News spread around the world of Rodney's invention. It was a novel idea that sparked enthusiasm from Steven Spielberg, who wanted to capture live footage of sharks for his new movie, Jaws. Rodney was approached by an American dive travel company who wanted to offer their clients the ultimate shark experience and take them on shark cage diving tours. So from Rodney's experimental cage diving, a whole new tourism industry was born, an industry that is still incredibly popular today. And now, more than half a century later, and with his life devoted to sharks, Rodney is reminded every day of the incident that changed his life forever. A piece of the shark's tooth is still embedded in his wrist. The idyllic island of Maui is considered a paradise, but below the turquoise waters lies a hidden danger. As father and grandfather Thomas Smiley took his final swim of his holiday, a tiger shark that was being tracked by wildlife officials closes in. All of a sudden, his fate is in the jaws of an enormous tiger shark as he fights to stay alive. Hit like and subscribe. This is Fierce. 65-year-old Thomas Smiley should have been living his best life. He had retired only the year before from a career as an optometrist. He had owned 2 optometry practices in Roseville and Sacramento. He and his wife Gail had bought a holiday home on the Ka'anapali shores on the idyllic Hawaiian island of Maui, a place they frequently visited for their vacations. It was their favorite spot, and they secured a place for the entire family to spend their holidays should they wish. Thomas was a family man. He and his wife Gail were high school sweethearts and had been married for 42 years. They had 3 children and 6 grandchildren who Thomas was looking forward to spending more time with now that he had finished his busy professional career. In May 2019, from their home in Granite Bay, California, Thomas and Gail were visiting Hawaii once again. They had been vacationing there for more than 14 years. It was a lovely morning, and Thomas took a fateful dip in the ocean at Ka'anapali Beach Park in western Maui. It was 9 in the morning, and Thomas decided on a refreshing dip just before breakfast. He was thinking this would be his last swim for a while, as they were due to fly home the very next day. As it turned out, it did end up being Thomas's last swim, but for very different reasons. Thomas was a highly accomplished man, having earned his undergraduate degree in cell biology from UCLA and received his doctorate in optometry from UC Berkeley. But his life wasn't all about work. It was far more about play. He was an antique and muscle car expert and stock car racer. He was a member of the Sports Car Club of America and was due to race his vintage 1965 Corvette on tracks across Northern California in the Advanced Pro X class in just 2 weeks' time. But he would never make it. He also loved the water and often spent his time snorkeling, scuba diving, water skiing, and swimming. It was a lovely stretch of coastline, but a predator was swimming along it exactly at the moment Thomas entered the water that day. It was a tiger shark, and it was being tracked by the Department of Land and Natural Resources. They were studying its movements, and its presence in the waters just off the resort was known to wildlife officials. But there were no warning signs erected along the beach. Instead, tourists were allowed to enter the water completely unaware of the dangers they were putting themselves in. Tiger sharks are one of the largest shark species in the world. They can grow up to 18 feet, or 5.5 meters long, and weigh in excess of 1,700 pounds, or 900 kilograms. Their fearless and typically aggressive nature, along with their tendency to swim in warm coastal waters, makes them especially dangerous for humans. As Thomas swam parallel to shore about 60 yards out, the shark approached him from behind, an enormous shadow just under the surface of the water, trailing its potential prey. Thomas continued to swim, completely oblivious to the imminent attack. Then the shark lunged forward, its serrated teeth clamping down on his left leg. Thomas was tugged under the water. The force from the bite was so powerful, it felt like his leg was going to give way. He fought back. In those terrifying moments, he knew exactly what had happened. He knew he was in the jaws of a shark. When he turned to see his attacker, he came face to face with the enormous fish. The commotion was witnessed on shore. Gail heard some cries. She walked out onto the lanai and looked out across the ocean. She could see people pointing out into the water. There were no snorkelers. Instead, a lone person was struggling out in the water. He was clearly in distress. Her immediate thought was Thomas, but she knew he was an exceptional swimmer. Being in the water was second nature for Thomas, so if anybody was going to be in trouble in the water, it was unlikely to be him. Even so, Gail continued to watch as the person struggled to get to shore. There was a lack of first responders in the area. The man cried out for help, but none came. Witnesses on the beach couldn't reach him. They just watched on in horror as the man tried desperately to make it back to the shore. But under the surface of the water, he was bleeding profusely. He was losing his energy. He was losing the fight. Finally, a jet ski was scrambled, but they had left too late. The police rescue unit wave runner started up and sped over to Thomas, who was still thrashing around in the water. He was surrounded by a cloud of dark red water. His movements were growing less now, and as the officers arrived, he had lost consciousness. The shark had disappeared below the surface. They pulled him onto the jet ski and raced him to shore. All the while, his wife watched on. Only when she saw his swimsuit did she realize that it was Thomas. Her heart dropped, and she screamed and ran over to him. She lay by his side and looked at his face. He was pale and unresponsive. She knew he had gone. Although officers tried CPR, they weren't able to bring Thomas back, and he died at the scene. It was a massive shock for Gail. She had seen him happily swimming in the water just moments before, living his best life. They were about to embark on their retirement together, and had been best friends and inseparable ever since first meeting in high school. Now, Gail would have to navigate her new life without him by her side. The shark had completely severed his left leg below the knee. His wrist, where he tried to fight off the shark, was lacerated and had lost all its skin. He had lost too much blood while in the water. The attack had happened so quickly that there was little anybody could do. The death of Thomas was a huge shock for all who knew him. He lived for his family. His children and grandchildren meant everything to him. His wife said that his attitude toward life was never be afraid of trying new things or putting yourself out there. His adventurous streak in life meant that he lived life to the fullest. Although Gail doesn't blame officials for Thomas's death, she knows for a fact that he would not have gone swimming that day had he known that there was a tiger shark in the area. He was just in the wrong place at the wrong time. Hawaii sees about 20 shark attacks per year. Thomas's attack was the first fatal shark attack in Hawaii since 2015, when a snorkeler was killed off Maui, just 40 miles to the south of where Thomas was attacked. Thomas was the sixth person attacked by a shark in Hawaii that year. In an island state that is surrounded by water, human-shark encounters are bound to be more common. There are suggestions that climate change is driving the increasing number of shark attacks in Hawaii, with changing ocean temperatures and movement of prey the main driving force. Rob Pedretti was 60 years old and a devoted surfer. He was part of the surfing community, regularly joining his friends out on the waters of Australia's Gold Coast. It wasn't just the lure of the waves that drew him to the water, it was also the marine wildlife and his respect for nature. Surfing in Australian waters always meant that sharks are never far away, but rarely do they cause harm. But for the unlucky few, these marine predators strike, causing devastating consequences. It's something that surfers try not to think about as they bob up and down on their boards, waiting for their next wave. Originally from Geelong in Victoria, Rob had lived in Two Gun, Queensland for 20 years. He was semi-retired, having worked successfully as a tiler, and now he hit the surf nearly every day with his friends. He was living his best life. In June 2020, he entered the water with his mates Frank Schlee and Mark Hayes at the coastal town of Kingscliff, just south of Tweed Heads in New South Wales. They paddled out to just beyond the surf, ducking under the crashing waves until they came to the calm water where they sat on their boards waiting for the perfect wave. It was how they enjoyed spending their time. They laughed and joked while out on the water, but as they bobbed about on their surfboards, a great white shark swam undetected below them. She was a 3.5-meter, 11-foot opportunistic predator. The water was clear and the surf relatively gentle. The surfers on the surface of the sea were silhouetted against the bright sun above them. It was about 10 a.m. when, without warning, the great white shark propelled itself upward toward the group of surfers. It locked its eyes on one silhouette in particular. It was Rob. Unaware of the imminent danger he was in, Rob continued to sit on a surfboard, looking over his shoulder at the rising waves. All of a sudden, he was knocked on his side. He glanced down and stared right into the jaws of an enormous shark. Before he could react, it bit down on the back of his left thigh. Rob let out a yell and clung onto his board. He gripped it, refusing to be taken beneath the waves. But the shark was too powerful. With one tug, Rob was yanked off his board and into the water. He grappled with the shark. He gasped for air every time he broke the surface. He continued relentlessly to hit the animal, trying to free his leg from its jaws. His friends Frank and Mark saw the commotion. Terror filled them. They could see the huge head of the animal. They could see its body arching up and out of the sea as it drove Rob down each time. Its tail thrashed wildly, and the terrifying dorsal fin protruded through the surface. Below it was the large dark shadow of its body, an impressive and alarming giant below the waves. Instead of making a swim for it and saving themselves, Frank and Mark rushed to help their friend. There was no way they were leaving him there while he struggled just feet from where they paddled. The shark was still holding on to Rob's leg. His fight was fading. Blood poured from his leg. When Frank and Mark joined the fight, the shark let go. Rob was finally free from its grip, and Frank pulled him onto his board. But the shark hadn't finished yet. Undeterred by the other surfers stepping in, it continued to follow them as they paddled toward the shore. It was a truly horrific situation to be in. Frank and Mark had put their lives on the line to save their friend. Not only had they attacked the shark, its rough sandpapery skin scraping them as they rained their fists down on it, but the blood that poured from Rob's open wound was a dangerous thing to be surrounded by. A cloud of dark dread followed them, trailing behind them as they inched their way closer to shore. Then they spotted the shark's dorsal fin again. This time it was in front of them. They could see the shadow of its body just below the surface. Its eyes were fixed on the trio. Any moment now, they thought that it might strike again. Any moment it could take one of them, but the two friends paddled onwards, pushing their gravely injured friend closer to dry land. The shark's dorsal fin was now beside them. They now realized that the shark was circling them. She was investigating them, waiting for the opportune moment to strike again, or perhaps waiting for Rob to succumb. But his friends wouldn't leave him now. Mercifully, they made it to the shallows. They leapt off their boards and carried Rob onto the sand, but he was limp and unresponsive. His leg was torn open at the upper thigh. His artery had been severed and he was losing consciousness. Emergency services had been called and arrived at the beach. Paramedic Terry Savage from NSW Ambulance was the first on the scene. He described Rob's injuries as significant and the whole scene as very confronting. It was something that nobody can prepare for. They tried their best to save Rob, but although his friends had retrieved him from the water alive, he died on the sand before making it to the ambulance just 40 minutes after the attack. It was a devastating and tragic incident that shook the surfing community. Rob was such a well-liked man. and nobody ever had a bad word to say about him. He was described by his family as humble, fun-loving, down-to-earth, and an all-around legend. There was an order by police to kill the shark. Typically, sharks are protected, but the way this one was behaving was cause for concern. Not only had it relentlessly attacked Rob, but it hadn't backed away when the other two arrived to help. It had pursued all three of them, continuing to circle them until they made it to the shallows. An order to kill a shark is given if it's seen as a threat to further life. It seemed that this one fit the bill. Helicopters, jet skis, and drones were scrambled to search for the shark. It was found still lurking in the area more than 3 hours after the attack. She had smelled blood, and she wanted more. As she was tailed by the motorboats, she then swam into deeper water and away from the area. Further along the coast, jet skis patrolled the water, warning swimmers and surfers to get out. Signs were erected, and beaches from Kingscliff, 6 miles south to Cabarita, were closed for 24 hours. This was extended when the shark was spotted the following day. Sadly, Rob was the third person to be killed by a shark in Australia that year. There was no way that Rob would want the shark to be culled. He and his friends didn't just love surfing, they also loved the marine life out there. He was against installing shark nets due to the danger they posed to marine life. He, like his friends, knew the risks of entering the shark's domain. Living in Australia, they heard about the tragedies of shark attacks that befell surfers and swimmers every year, but they loved the sport and the enjoyment it gave them. Although Rob was gone, his family and friends had to live with the shocking way in which he died. His friend Frank, who has selflessly and bravely come to his aid, was so traumatized by the incident that he received counseling to deal with it. A tear-jerking vigil and memorial service was held for Rob on the beach and his favorite surf spot. His friends and the wider surfing community also performed a paddle out to remember the surfer.